Morning, welcome to this morning's Transport Committee meeting. We will be discussing the Rotherhithe to Canary Wharf crossing. Can I ask if there have been any apologies?
Thank you, Chair. We have apologies from Assembly members Bacon, Bailey, McCartney and Shah. Assembly member Desai is joining as a substitute for the Labour group.
Great. Just to welcome anybody join us online, our hashtag is Assembly Transport, and to any guests here and my colleagues, just to make sure that your phone is switched off, please. Not vibrate, because we can still pick that up. Are there any other declarations that we should note? They all noted?
Noted.
Thank you. To welcome our guests this morning, we have before us the Deputy Mayor for Transport, Heidi Alexandra, and David Rowe from TfL, who's the Head of Major Project Sponsorship. Before we start this morning's meeting, looking at the decision to pause the Rotherhithe to Canary Wharf Bridge, we've got a short video that we're going to show, which shows just going down to the scene and just speaking to local residents about what they think about TfL's decision to pause the bridge. Thank you.
People want to walk to work, they want to cycle to work, but they don't want to cycle to work when they have to cycle into London and back outside of London.
Who needs a big bridge that in the winter wouldn't be that clever to cross?
They should have made one, because to get to like Canary Wharf, it's so close, yet like so far to get to.
I think that East London need more crossing, because the near one is London Bridge.
The alternative would be a ferry crossing, and that would be a lot more better.
People just like love to like walk, and then because I like cycling around here, it's good.
Very short, and that view is very much echoed at the Southwark Council meeting, which I attended on Wednesday, where a number of groups presented a deputation to the council, calling on the council to continue to work with me as their local assembly member to look at why this bridge is paused and if we can bring it back. So just to come on to that, Deputy Mayor, from your letter you sent to me on the 21st of June outlining that, the decision to pause the bridge, we just wondered if you could go through and set out clearly and clarify the chronology of events which led to the escalation of the cost of this project.
Okay, well, thank you for the opportunity to come and speak to you this morning. I think it might be helpful if I address my involvement in the project over the last 12 months since I've been in the role, and if I ask David Rowe to talk about the 2 years prior to that, between 2016 and 2018. So if I start last summer, within weeks of being appointed to this post, I was briefed in writing by officers from TfL, and they gave me a simple history of what work had been done to date, and they advised me that the cost estimate for the bridge at that point in time was between 380 million and 430 million pounds, which was substantially more than what the initial cost estimates were. In fact, David may correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the upper estimate that was taken to the Programmes and Investment Committee of TfL back in October 2017 was 260 million. So I knew at that stage that the team at TfL were working on the precise designs for the bridge, the alignment of the bridge, you know, how many lifts and ramps, etc., would be needed. The Commissioner was very clear with me that the instruction that he had given to the TfL team were to try and get those costs down from the 380 to 430 million pound estimate. In September, the Mayor and I received a further update from TfL which suggested that the costs would be between 355 million and 395 million, hence the allocation in the business plan which was published in December of last year for 350 million pounds. In the early part of this year, TfL continued to work on the project intensively. There was a lot of detailed, really extensive work that was happening. They produced a new design for a vertical lifting bridge. It's important to say this would be a very, very big and complex structure, 3 times the span of Tower Bridge. The clearance height that would be required is the same as the cable car further down the river. The Institution of Civil Engineers were asked to look at the choice of design because there were a number of options that had previously been considered, and we may get into the detail of what that review showed. Atkins, as I understand it, produced an initial cost estimate for that design, which TfL's internal assurance team reviewed. And then as that work progressed towards the very end of March, beginning of April in this year, I got a further update from TfL. They told me that the midpoint estimate for the bridge, having done all of this very intensive detailed work, was now £455 million. That went up, having done more work, to £463 million in May. That was the point at which I became quite concerned about the short to medium term deliverability of this project, because costs were only going one way. All of the substantive value engineering options had been explored. I also knew that there wasn't going to be cash to be thrown around in this year's business plan, and so the Mayor and I discussed this with TfL in mid-May. The Mayor asked TfL to go away and do some work on reviewing the case for the scheme and looking again at the ferry option, and that resulted in a paper being taken to the Programmes and Investment Committee of TfL in June, and as soon as they took a decision, Chair, you will know that I wrote to you the day after when they decided to go back to the earlier stage in the project development process, which was looking at the options again of a bridge versus a ferry. I would just like to add that this decision was not one that was taken lightly. I'm someone that when I first moved to London and couldn't afford a travel card, I cycled from Balham to Canary Wharf for 6 months for my first job in London, and having navigated 4 lanes of traffic on the northern side of Tower Bridge, I think there are a few people in London who understand the importance of improved river crossings in this part of London more than me, but I have to, in this role, think with my head and not my heart. I knew that this project was entering a phase where we would be spending nearly £1 million a month on developing the scheme further, and yet I knew, given the wider financial context of TfL, that in the short to medium term there would not be money available realistically in the next 5 years to be constructing this. And so we took the responsible decision, I think, with the Programmes and Investment Committee of TfL to go back to that earlier stage where we look at what the different options are. And as the Mayor said yesterday, this would have been a great project. It would have been wonderful to have constructed a world first, but this cannot be at any cost. And the cost was only going in one direction, and that is what led to the decision back in June.
So just to clarify, is there anything you wanted to bring in, David?
If it's helpful, I can run through the chronology from 2016 in terms of how the costs have built up and what the factors were that have driven those increases.
Very quickly, please.
Okay, so I joined the scheme in spring 2017. Prior to that, TfL had already allocated within its business plan £100 million towards the crossing. It's important to say at that point that we had not confirmed whether it would be a bridge, a tunnel or a ferry. Those were our shortlisted options that we were looking at. Even at that early stage, the estimates that we had for a bridge were from 150 million, which excluded land and inflation, through to 200 million. And those initial estimates were produced by a company for us called Faithful & Gould, who are a cost and programme management consultancy worldwide. And what they did was they looked across bridges that had been delivered in other parts of the world, Europe, UK, different types of bridges, road bridges, rail bridges, pedestrian and cycle bridges, with different types of opening mechanisms. They logged information on the spans, the widths, the lengths, various other factors, to produce a cost per metre average, which we could then apply at that point in terms of producing that preliminary estimate. We didn't at that point have a design for a bridge because we were still building the case to ascertain which was the best solution. So that's why we weren't able to build what's called a bottom-up estimate, which is where you use a design to then quantify what the cost might be. We then did further work, and we went through what's called our Stage Gate 2 in September 2017, and at that point the estimate for the bridge was between 150 million and 260 million, and that was taken to our Programme and Investment Committee. And at that time we were also looking at 3 possible alignments in terms of where the bridge could land. We, after we'd gone to pick and they confirmed that they agreed with our recommendation that actually the bridge was the best of the options that we'd identified at that point, we then went out to public consultation and we asked people whether they agreed with our recommendation that a bridge was the right crossing solution here. And we also asked for their views on the 3 different crossing alignments, and therefore that helped us inform which ones we should be narrowing down going forward. When we'd done that work and we had the results of the consultation, we then did much more detailed testing around the designs. So when that detailed testing took place, what became clear quite quickly is that the bridge designs that had been produced were not going to be sufficiently rigid and robust to stand the day-to-day prevailing conditions on this part of the river. And the particular challenges were wind resistance here, were the tides, and the amount of opening that was required in relation to this bridge. And this bridge has a 120-year design life, and we wanted to try and test that in earnest to understand what was necessary. So that was the sort of next point where costs increased effectively, because what that meant was we had to increase the strength of the structure, so we had to add more steel into the structure. That meant we needed stronger mechanical and electrical lifting equipment, we needed larger foundations, and all of that was driving up the costs. So even then, we were aware that there were challenges, and we were doing what we could to try and bring that cost back down. So for example, with the Port of London Authority, we'd agreed that we could reduce the height of the bridge down from 15 metres to 12 metres. Heidi's spoken about the subsequent cost increases, but I'm happy to explain why they came about if that's helpful for the committee.
So I think just to clarify then, if we go back to 2016, so the original funding, the original figure in the business plan is 100 million.
Yep.
Yep. In the briefings when TfL went out to consultation in November 2017, the capital costs were estimated between 120 to 180 million.
That's correct in terms of that was the figure that's quoted in the consultation material that we published, which is 2016 prices. So what we did as part of the consultation to ensure people had a fair understanding of the cost of a bridge compared with a ferry, compared with the Immerse Tunnel, which was the other option, was to put everything on the same basis in terms of the year that was analysed, as well as put in what are called the whole life costs, so the ongoing operational and maintenance costs that are associated with those different options as well. So where I spoke about the figure of 150 to 260, that includes the inflation allowances that we need to add on for when the project is actually built. And
you're saying that included whole inflation. Did that include the operating, renewal and maintenance cost of the bridge?
No, that's
so what was the figure for that when you went out to consultation in November 2017?
So that is in the same consultation report. I think the figures at that time were £2.4 million a year, if I remember rightly off the top of my head. 2.2 to 2.4.
And what figures are you looking at now?
So over the life of the bridge, so over that 120 years, the average is £3.5 million per annum. Now, it's important to remember that that's the average across that whole of that period, so you have to discount that back for the early years. So in today's terms, it's about £1 million a year, but obviously it gets progressively more expensive as you move through that life cycle period.
Deputy Mayor, so this was before your time, and I think, David, you said that you started in spring 2017, is that correct? So we note that the sponsorship and budget of this project was transferred to Surface Transport in April 2017?
That's the point that it came across to.
Where was it before that, and where were the decisions being made?
So the early feasibility work that is done around our larger strategic schemes is done through our city planning department. So they did that initial work for us, and then that came across to us when it was at a point where we needed to move from a decision from looking at the case of the scheme to what's the right solution.
So in terms of the estimates, they would have been happy presenting those figures to the senior leadership team, the city planning?
Yes, as I say, that was based on the information that we put together for them for first put on board.
Just coming back to when you then decided to look at pausing the project, Deputy Mayor, and you, in your letter, you stated that 350 million had been allocated in the business plan. Can you just clarify how much has been allocated for the project over the 5 years of the business plan?
That £350 million pound figure relates to the 5-year period of the business plan, albeit I think I will ask David just to pick up on perhaps some of the detail around whether any of that slipped beyond the end of the 5-year business planning period.
So there was a residual amount of that 350 which sat outside the 5 years, and the reason for that is the final year that our forecast showed in terms of the construction of a new bridge was 24-25. It was just the start of that year, and so the approach that we take with projects is that you hold a certain amount back in terms of retention for any defects or faults that you need corrected by a contractor. So it spans slightly beyond the 2018 business plan.
And in terms of the different cost escalations that we are seeing in this bridge, which body, could you just clarify the body that would have been discussing these figures? Is it the Independent Investment Advisory Group?
So IIPAG reviews a number of the large-scale projects and programmes that TfL are doing. In terms of the governance of this project, it was reported through internally through the Healthy Streets Portfolio Board, and when there were significant and important decisions, it would come to the Programme and Investment Committee, and that is why it was the Programme and Investment Committee that in June took the decision to return to the earlier stage in the project's development.
Okay. I'm going to come out to Assemblymember Pigeon, who's going to dig in a bit more detail in terms of the decisions and where those decisions were made.
Yep, thank you. I made a note of what you were saying earlier, Deputy Mayor. Could you just clarify when you were told the cost has escalated, and you said it had gone to 455 million and then it became 463 million in May. So when were you told the 455?
Right at the end of March.
So that was at the end of March?
The very end of March. I think it
right,
would
so
have
very
been
end
one
of
of
March,
the last days in March.
You're told this is going up.
Mm-hmm.
By May it had gone up further.
Mm-hmm.
Mid-May you said there was a discussion with the Mayor.
Correct.
So was there a briefing paper sent to the Mayor for that meeting?
A briefing paper was prepared for a meeting with the Mayor at the beginning of April, where we had a lengthy discussion at which David was present. There wasn't a further paper prepared in May, but there was a discussion with the Commissioner present, and we talked about the ferry option as well, and that was the point at which the Mayor in the middle of May asked TfL to go and review the case for the bridge and explore the ferry option again in more detail. And that was partly because in the 6 weeks between the first week in April and mid-May, when that work had taken place, we had said to David and his team, we want everything to be explored in terms of bringing these costs down. The Commissioner, David, Gareth Powell, had said we've done 6 months of work on this now. There may have been 1 or 2 further things to explore. I thought that given the significance of this project, it was important that we left no stone unturned. But between the beginning of April and the middle of May, that was when, despite that work being done, the costs weren't coming down, and that was, on the back of 3 or 4 months' work at the beginning of the year, when absolutely everything was being explored, using concrete instead of steel in the towers, looking at whether we needed lifts and ramps on both sides, looking again at things like the landing points. But the truth is, in sort of April, May time of this year, I felt that Transport for London had gone through all of the major opportunities for value engineering on this project. And once you've constantly been doing that really detailed, intensive work, and there isn't really any further to go on that, it was at that point that we felt it was the responsible thing to do, not least because David was advising us that there was a need to let some quite big contracts, which would have resulted in TfL spending nearly £1 million a month to develop this project, when there was no realistic prospect of finding that additional 100 million, possibly an additional 250 million in the business planning round that is in front of us and that we're, starting in the next couple of months. And so, that was the context in which that decision was taken.
So I'm trying to pick up some process things because obviously, I'm a huge advocate for this bridge. I think it would be absolutely fantastic, but I understand you've got to make decisions, and I'm just trying to understand the process. My colleague's going to pick up some of the issues with the mayor in a bit. But David, what were these contracts that you were looking to let, and how urgent was it to let these contracts? Because this project had been going on for some time. April, we were told there was going to be a consultation. That then got scrapped, delayed, and we were told you were working up further detailed stuff to go out to consult in the autumn. What was it that was so urgent that you were about to sign?
So the next very significant stage of work for us was a series of surveys that we needed to do to ascertain information on things like ground condition as well as condition of the riverbed. And that was fundamental to ensuring that the alignment that we'd selected through our work with the PLA, the boroughs and others, we weren't going to find anything untoward in terms of what particular ground conditions we were going to be challenged with. So that would have been both very expensive but also quite intrusive in terms of the work, because it would have meant, for example, quite significant works at places like Durrance Wharf as well as at Westbury Circus in terms of undertaking those surveys. We really couldn't move forward any further without having done that work, because that's fundamental to be able to ascertain, yes, there is nothing untoward in this part of the river that we hadn't anticipated. Now, we already had some survey information. The Jubilee line runs quite close to here, but that only gave us a certain amount, which is why we had these additional surveys that we need to do for the next stage.
You could have signed that contract within a week or within a month or within 2 months, given how the project had been slightly slipping in any case.
So we already had that contract that we'd gone through the procurement process for, and that was there. It was ready to go. We had to make a decision on it, because otherwise those costs effectively become redundant, because you have to go through a repricing process with potential tenderers.
But not if it's a few weeks later, presumably.
Well, we had a timetable that we published in terms of when we were looking to let that contract. So we had to make a decision as to whether we were going to pursue that or whether we should pause that.
So when were you looking to let the contract?
So that was part of the timing for the decision in May. So we had already paused that whilst we were doing this additional work during the period of March and April, and we were sort of waiting on it for a period, but it could have called into question as to how long you can wait to do that.
Okay, because the issue I have is that the announcement of this decision was rather bizarre. A letter to the chair of our committee, which most of us saw on Twitter first before any sort of formal process. But it wasn't actually made by the committee in a normal way, where there's a discussion at the committee in public. It was made under a chair's action. So on Tuesday, the 18th of June, TfL Chair's Action short report went out to the committee members. They had to feedback by the Thursday. Decision was made on the Friday. But a Chair's Action, according to TfL standing orders, it's only in a situation of urgency. The board delegates to each chair of a committee or panel to exercise the functions of TfL on its behalf. So it seems to me, given you'd already paused this, to allow a few more weeks so this could have properly gone to a full committee, which met a couple of days ago, where there would have been a discussion with all the members in front of the press and the public. There was no discussion about this in public this week. It just seems to me it's a very odd use, possibly a misuse, really, of standing orders. But it seems to me it wasn't urgent.
I answer that.
Yeah, please do.
I totally refute that. I think David has explained the reasons why this substantial contract, and given it had already been paused once, needed a decision to be taken about whether to let it or not. You know, I think that when you're talking about expenditure that is possibly hundreds of thousands of pounds, it's important that you don't delay on those decisions. I have been a member of the Programme and Investment Committee for the last year. A number of urgent decisions come through, whether it's the Programme and Investment Committee or the Finance Committee, or you know, some of the other committees that exist within the TfL board structure. A full paper is written. Members of the committee are able to comment on the contents of it. Often the members will comment to all other members of the committee, and there will be a discussion about it. I can confirm for you that there was a number of people engaged in response to that paper being circulated, and so I think, given the urgency, it was an appropriate route for this decision to be taken, and I was absolutely clear that having taken that decision, it was imperative that we put it into the public domain, hence my letter to the chair of the committee the following day.
Well, I personally think it's a strange way to have proceeded with this, because I don't see the absolute urgency, and that's where I see this standing order coming in. But what I would ask is, could we see that email exchange so we can see what members of the committee did say? Because if we'd been at a committee and heard them, we could see what concerns they'd raised. I think that would help our discussion if we could see that email exchange and comments from the committee.
I see no reason why that couldn't be made available.
That would be fantastic. Can I move on to these plans? Clearly you came up with this design, a different design, and you said that the Institute of Civil Engineers had done some sort of review, and I asked the Mayor about this yesterday, whether all bridge designs had had an independent review. Can you confirm that?
When we decided that the right solution from our perspective was a central lifting bridge, we then asked the Institute to undertake an independent review of that mechanism compared with the other options that we developed. So we looked at three, essentially, in terms of a short list of possible options for how you could design a bridge on this bit of the river. So just to very simply explain what those options are, you have something called a central lifting bridge, which is where the opening section goes up and down like that. You have a possible swing bridge, where the opening sections do that to allow the boats through. Or you have what's called a bascule bridge, which is similar to Tower Bridge, so it does that. The Institute of Civil Engineers appointed somebody called Ian Firth to lead that review.
So Ian Firth did the review of all three designs.
Ian Firth is the former president of the Institute of Structural Engineers. He is a world-renowned expert on bridges. We were very comfortable that that was the right person to bring in, given his experiences on bridges. I do have the report in front of me, and I'm happy to read the conclusion for you if that's helpful in terms of what they found.
We'd like to see the report, really, please.
Well, I'm sure that would be possible too.
We'd like to see it to really understand the work you've done to get to this point. Thank you.
We'll share it with you. I think it would be helpful, though, for David to read the conclusions of the report.
Okay. So the conclusions are, there are three types of opening bridge mechanisms that have been considered: a double leaf bascule, a double leaf swing, or a vertical lifting bridge. It is clear that the double leaf bascule bridge is the least preferred solution, and it presents several difficulties, making it doubtful as a viable option for the bridge. It would be approximately twice the size of any double bascule bridge built to date. The swing bridge would be feasible, but has a number of undesirable features, such as the added risk of vessel impact on the opening spans. In addition, the bridge would need a locking mechanism between the leaves at mid-span, and these can create difficulties in operation, leading to risk of delays in opening the bridge with unacceptable consequences to navigation. The preferred operating mechanism is the vertical lifting bridge. It is the simplest and most reliable operating system, presenting the fewest risks and the greatest opportunities.
Okay, thank you for that. It'd be great to see.
What was the date of that, please?
So the final report was...
I think the final report was provided at the beginning of April. I think the
8th of April.
Yeah, 8th of April. The final report was provided. I think an initial draft came a couple of weeks prior to that.
Lovely, thank you. And did Ian Firth, working on behalf of the Institute of Civil Engineers, talk to the other architects practice reform design who had actually developed a bascule bridge to actually understand some of their technical information drawings, or was this just a generic bascule that they were working on?
So there are certainly references in the report to the Sustrans Commission design through reform. I don't know if there were conversations directly between Ian and the reform.
Would that not have been something you'd asked if you were trying to look at a proper independent review of a scheme that was already out there?
What we wanted was him to look at the different possible solutions that you could come up with here in terms of a bridge, not just focus on what we had done or what reform had done, and make a recommendation to us on what was the right solution for this part of the river, given the challenges that we have.
Okay.
Sorry, so but just to clarify, that Sustrans consultation and feasibility study was partly funded by TfL?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah. So it's a strange...
That you wouldn't refer back to it?
No, as I say, it does make reference to it, but whether he had a direct conversation with reform, I don't know.
Yeah, you'd have thought they would want to get behind some of their figures and stuff, because certainly their costings that I had seen, which were assessed independently as well, came in a lot lower than where you have ended up. So that's why, and actually the mayor yesterday said if there's a way we could deliver this a lot cheaper, you know, he would want to. He's still very keen, if possible, on the bridge idea. Going just forward, should TfL really have consulted key stakeholders perhaps at an earlier stage to understand the complexities and costs of this project? Is there more that should have been done earlier?
So we've been engaging with key stakeholders, the London boroughs, landowners, Port of London Authority, Environment Agency, all of the significant parties that you might expect from the outset in terms of the development of this. So I don't think it's the case that we've come to the party late in terms of engaging with anybody, but it is a case that as a design progresses, there is more rigorous testing of that design that needs to take place. As I said, when we did the consultation back in 2017, we had 3 different alignment options that we were looking at, and actually that had come from a list of something in the order of 30 different alignment options that we'd initially investigated. So it's only once you begin to refine down and do that more detailed testing that you're able to ascertain whether there are changes that are required.
Your conversations with the PLA were obviously important, and you've already mentioned earlier that they had reduced the height needed from 15 to 12, which would save considerably on your structure in terms of costs. In some ways, you'd think the price would have started to come down if they were being more flexible with their requirements. Last week at Budget Committee, your colleague who was there mentioned one of the big things he could recall that had led to the increase in costs was to do with shipping impact or something. Yeah. Was that a new thing the PLA suddenly put on the table, or was it specifically because of this new design?
So we've always had ship impact protection within our designs, but in the sort of autumn of 2018, the PLA and ourselves agreed some additional detailed testing. They also brought in harbour masters who use this part of the river to really pressure test in terms of what happens if there is an incident on this part of the river. And the outcome of that was that the ship impact protection, which was previously proposed, needed to be enlarged. Now, the ship impact protection, in simple terms, is a sort of buffer that you need to put around the towers that are in the river. Now, when the ship impact protection gets bigger, in order to protect the size of the navigable channel, you need to move the main spans further out of the navigable channel. The consequence of that is you have a longer middle opening section, and therefore that requires strengthening in the amount of steel. You need stronger towers, you therefore need bigger foundations, you need heavier mechanical and electrical equipment to lift it. So all of that was what was driving up the cost at that point.
So the PLA in your discussions, once they saw the design that you had come up with, your preferred design, your lifting bridge, felt that you needed more around the towers, and therefore that ultimately led to increased costs.
Yes, and as I say, that was done in association with Harbour Masters. That's not to say the only thing we were looking at is what would you need to do to the bridge. So we were also in discussions with them around things like what could we do around speed limits on this part of the river, what could we do around signing, lighting, various other mitigating factors, because we didn't want to move to an automatic solution being, right, this needs to get bigger. We wanted to try and employ as many residents as possible to try and keep that cost down.
One of the things in some of the IPAG paperwork that we have seen that worried me is in July 2017, IPAG were concerned that the normal sequencing of projects is not being followed. Early days, but shortcuts seem to have been made, and if they continue, likely to lead to cost and timescale problems in the future. Just wondering how, David, you reacted to that and put in place measures that would have reassured IPAG that we weren't in the situation we've been in the past, where, you know, a project had, such as the Garden Bridge, saw lots of sort of shortcuts and problems along the way.
So, as part of this work, we've assembled a really strong team from both within TfL as well as externally in terms of the skills and knowledge that was needed to take this forward.
Who externally? Could you just
so
list them?
externally, we've had our first engineering and design consultants were Arcadis. They were on board until the end of 2017, and then we went back out to the market and we brought in Atkins at that point to provide that support. We also have Marico, who are marine engineers. They employ ex-harbour masters, so they're very experienced in terms of works within this part of the river. We have an organisation called Quad, who are planning consultants. We have MOTS, who are environmental consultants. And then there are some smaller consultancies that we also use on specialist areas, such as legal advice and other things. So where we didn't have the right skills in-house, we've made sure that we've supported the team in terms of bringing in that expertise. What we've also done at various points is ensure that we use external organisations to challenge the way that we've done things. So we had Costain, for example, who were providing advice to us around constructability as well as some of the design factors. So they looked at the design to ensure that we were taking a view on whether there were opportunities where we could further value engineer down some of the aspects of the bridge design. When we also went through the process of that sort of design finalisation and costing, we also brought in other organisations, such as Cleveland Bridge, who are specialist steel bridge contractors, to provide advice on the costing and benchmarking of our costs. We brought in the American Bridge Company, who are moving bridge specialists. We brought in steel specialists, foundation specialists, mechanical and electrical specialists. We really...
You don't have any teams in-house on this, do you?
to ensure that we weren't sort of missing anything in terms of what the opportunities were to either think about something differently or ensure that we were being robust in terms of how we were costing the factors within the bridge design.
But you're just on that, you're saying you had everything in place so that you didn't miss anything, but it clearly states in the IPAG reports they had issues with the size of the project board, which comprised of 13 people, and they state it was difficult to get accountability and decision makers. They also stated that IPAD recommends that the project provides a frank and honest assessment of the options, other options available, and a realistic assessment of the cost to the mayor and board members. Was all of this happening? Because we appreciate, yes, this is a big project, and you know, as Assembly Member Pigeon outlines, I very much want this. But again, alarm bells and red flags were coming up as early as March 2017.
So all of the key decisions that we've taken in terms of moving through the different stages from the initial case for the scheme through to whether it should be a bridge or a tunnel, that's gone through our sort of governance in terms of Healthy Streets Portfolio Board and then on to PIC where appropriate. But with any project, you have a project board in place to sort of oversee it on a weekly or monthly basis. So we brought together the various people from within TfL to ensure that we had that right representation there. That's not to say that we weren't using the appropriate governance within TfL in terms of each of the key decision points.
No, that was perfect, absolutely. I just think March 2017, they were flagging these issues. You came fresh to it then, David. You took over this.
Yep.
I don't understand what changes you made to how you were managing the project as a result of IPAG's comments to you.
Well, that's really where we brought in a much more extensive team with appropriate knowledge, both internally and externally, to ensure that we had the right level of capability to be able to take this project forward. We were also very conscious around things like the program that had been developed and challenging whether that was realistic, so the program was on board. And each time we did a briefing, for example, I know one of the reports that produced by IPAG, they said that they thought the program was ambitious. So we ensured that the information that was shared made very clear what the challenges were in relation to each of the activities and what that might mean if that caused a delay. So, for example, negotiations with landowners can sometimes take longer than you might anticipate, and therefore that can change the amount of time you might need in order to reach a satisfactory conclusion in terms of agreement on what that design needs to look like.
Okay, and obviously one of the issues always has been the funding of the bridge, but what other funding sources did you actively explore for the project? Because you've got British Land on one side, you've got Canary Wharf Group on the other, big developers developing lots of homes. This would benefit their residents, it would benefit their businesses. How much were they going to put in?
Would you like me to
Either
start with
of you,
the answer to that?
Yeah.
So my understanding is that there have been a number of discussions with the boroughs looking at things such as the use of community infrastructure levy on the Southwark side. Obviously there are competing demands for SIL. On the northern side of the river with Tower Hamlets, they have been clear and consistent that they didn't want to fund this. I understand that TfL also worked with an organisation that looks at philanthropic donations, and whilst there may have been some opportunity around subsidising the operating costs in the same way that there's currently that arrangement with the cable car, I'm not necessarily saying the same organisation, but there was limited scope around philanthropic contributions in this location with that bridge. And so I think a number of avenues were explored looking at third-party sources of funding. I think the point I would make is that if there had been a difference of, say, a gap of 5 or 10 million, it may have been something that you could plug. If you were at the very least looking at a gap of 100 million, between the 350 in the business plan and the 463 midpoint estimate that TfL had arrived at, and possibly an additional £250 million, the quantum of funding that you're trying to find is very, very significant. I was also very clear with TfL officers that I wanted them to look at options such as a workplace parking levy, to look at whether there may be a way to implement charges for parking on the Transport for London road network, which over time may provide some revenue. But none of those options were actually giving us any assurance that you could plug the gap that had emerged once the really detailed design work had been done.
And what about with those big landowners, British Land, Canary Wharf Group? Had you got any indication from them that they would contribute to this transport?
So we had discussions with all of the big landowners, Hilton Hotel, various others, as well as the ones you've mentioned. British Land, just to be clear on how the process works, because the bridge is referenced in Southwark's, what's they're called, their SIL register, you can't therefore get a Section 106 contribution through planning on top of SIL. Which is why we're having discussions around SIL. But we also did have discussions with Canary Wharf Group, and it was very clear that whilst they were supportive of the principle of the bridge, there wasn't going to be the opportunity for them to provide financial support towards it.
Okay, thank you very much. I think I'll leave that there for a moment. Thank you.
Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Good morning. I'll start with the Deputy Mayor, perhaps. Could you let us know when the Mayor was actually informed about the increasing complexities and costs associated with the project?
think I've already answered that question in response to Assembly Member Pigeon earlier. I can repeat it if you'd like me
would
to.
you mind?
Okay, no problem. So, you know, since I have been in post, I know that on at least 3 occasions we have briefed the Mayor in person with senior officers from Transport for London. And so in September of last year, there was a discussion about what the estimated costs were, about the emerging ideas around the design concept, the alignment. He and I were aware at that time that this was a terrifically complicated project and that any of the estimates that TfL were providing to us at that point in time, as more work was done, they could go up. We were also being told they might go down. The experience, though, between September and May of this year is that the costs were only ever going in one direction. And so the Mayor was personally briefed in April and May of what the latest position was.
Thank you. So, whose decision was it really to pause the bridge? Which I think is a sensible position to take, I hasten to say.
Okay, so it was the decision of the Programme and Investment Committee of Transport for London, as we've discussed already in this session. As I have also said already, in May we had a discussion with the Mayor where he asked TfL officers to go away and review the case for the bridge alongside the possibility of doing some additional work on getting a fast, frequent ferry option in place there. But it was a decision of the TfL Programme and Investment Committee to go back to an earlier stage of project development around what the options were, bridge versus ferry. The Mayor and I agreed with that decision.
But the decision was actually taken by, it was a chair's decision, wasn't it? It wasn't actually taken by any committee, it was a chair's decision.
Yeah, so as I explained to Assembly Member Pigeon, the paper is drawn up by TfL officers. When a chair's action is taken, either as part of the Programmes and Investment Committee or Finance Committee, the paper will be circulated to all members of that committee. They have an opportunity to comment on it. They have an opportunity to speak to the chair if they so wish. And then the decision was taken by the chair through a chair's action, but it was a decision of the Programme and Investment Committee.
But where did the Mayor play a part in this?
So, as I explained, I
seem to be making you repeat this, so I do humbly apologise for that.
Yeah,
but I just can't quite.
So the Mayor
I'm not quite getting the. Perhaps I should be a little bit clearer. I'm really interested in when the Mayor, at what point the Mayor said, "Okay, guys, I think we ought to put a halt to this," or did someone like your good self quite wisely say to him, "Well, Mr. Mayor, I think actually we need to put a break on here because we're going to be spending, so you don't repeat yourself, we're going to be spending £1 million a week," because I heard all that.
So given the briefings that had been provided to the Mayor in April and May, as I've talked about, and the discussions that we had, we were concerned about the deliverability of the bridge in the short to medium term, and I won't repeat the reasons for that.
No, I've got all that.
At that May meeting, the Mayor asked TfL to go away and do some more work, review the case. It culminated in a paper being circulated to members of the Programme and Investment Committee, I think on Tuesday the 18th of June. I was aware shortly before that a paper would be circulated to the Programme and Investment Committee and the contents of that paper, and you would expect me to brief the Mayor and his senior team on the contents of a paper such as that going round to the Programme and Investment Committee. He is, at the end of the day, the chair of the TfL board, and so that was the precise chronology over that period of time.
Right, okay. So we're saying really around about the 18th of June then, are we?
Shortly before that.
Just before
Yeah.
that? Okay, fine. Just a couple of other questions, if I may. I'm sorry. I probably went about it in the wrong way and apologise for having to make you repeat stuff that you've already said. A couple of concerns in the Independent Investment Programme Advisory Group. On more than one occasion, they refer to the main driver of the project being the commencement of the construction within the mayoral term, and also the drive from the mayor to get things moving more quickly, which, you know, I respect that, because he wants to get things along, and quite often these things don't happen unless you have the drive from the mayor, so I'm not criticising him for that. But I'm just wondering if any of that, because there's some sort of, if you read between the lines, that because of that sense of urgency, because of that drive to get something spade in the ground, so to speak, that could potentially add to the costs. There's an inference that could add to the costs. Is there, I should ask David, is there any truth in that, or is had we taken longer, could we perhaps found a
It's
cheaper
true to
way?
say there's an ambition on both TfL side and the mayor's side to realise the benefits that a new crossing here could deliver as quickly as possible, undoubtedly. That's not to say that we were holding back on any information in relation to what the challenges were and the significance of those challenges. So as I mentioned before, when we put a programme up, if it went into one of the mayor's briefings, it would have clearly stated against each of the activities what are the risks associated with those activities, and what might mean in terms of the timescale to actually get a spade on the ground in terms of the start of the work for 2020. So whilst 2020 was in our timetable in terms of being achievable, we also recognise that there are challenges along that way, and what those might be, and therefore what that might mean in terms of extending that timescale out.
Was there ever, either of you can answer this, was there ever a discussion around the fact that actually you could deliver the ferry a lot quicker if 2020 is the landing date? Oh, is it? Are we? All right. Well, I'll withdraw that question. Don't want to tread on someone else's toes or flippers or whatever it is for this. Fine. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Can I just pick up from Assemblymember Prince the mayoral briefing papers? Could we see those, please?
See, no problem with that.
Thank you.
We're just going to move on quickly, just mindful of time, colleagues, looking at lessons learned and next steps. So as I mentioned, Deputy Mayor David, there is still a lot of support for this in Southwark with a number of the residents and businesses, because there is sheer overcrowding in that part of the borough. Trying to navigate your way out of Canada Water tube station in the morning is quite a challenge. So we do need some provision around how we can get that part of London to promote active travel and help ease that transport congestion. Come over to my colleague, Assemblymember Copley, who will start on this section in terms of the estimates.
I wasn't told I was doing this section.
Apologies.
Sorry. Okay, fine, sorry. Yes, okay. Does TfL need to improve its initial cost estimates?
So I think if you look back to what David Hughes said at the Budget and Performance Committee last week, there is a recognition that this is an area which we need to get better at. And clearly there is a big difference between whether it's a sort of £150 million cost estimate up to a potential upper limit of £600 million. And so, you know, I think that is a sort of criticism that has been levelled at TfL, and I think that there is some merit in it, and we need to get better at it.
I mean, you meant, sorry, did you want to come
Well, I was just going to add to it that I mentioned how the initial estimates was produced, which was based on this cost model, looking at the outturn costs for different bridges across the world. And whilst that's extremely helpful in terms of giving us a cost per metre, clearly it wasn't adequate in terms of understanding the complexities on this part of the river, and therefore what was necessary in terms of the challenges to overcome some of those constraints and the design that was appropriate there. So yes, I would agree that actually we need to do more about that sort of early stage planning in terms of ensuring that there is more more in terms of local information that is brought to bear alongside that sort of cost benchmarking information from the outturns from other projects.
Because you mentioned this consultancy that you went to, you know, said you looked at a particular design, they came up with a cost per metre, was it, because you didn't have a particular design in mind. But presumably they look at the local circumstances, you know, as well. But is it that as you're going down the line, you come across other challenges that you weren't aware of at the beginning?
So there's both of those parts really. So it is a model which is built, as I say, from bridges that are all over the world, rail bridges, road bridges, pedestrian cycle bridges, different opening mechanisms, different lengths, different spans in terms of number of supports in the river, or some of these were in bays as well. All of that information is extremely helpful in giving us that range, but it didn't include enough around those local conditions. And really, TfL is not experienced in terms of delivering these types of projects. This is innovative for us, which is why we tried to bring in the appropriate level of expertise and knowledge from external organisations that have been involved in it. But it's only when you really go through that process in earnest and you develop the design and you robustly test it again and again and again, that you can fully appreciate some of the challenges and therefore what you need to do in terms of adjusting that design to ensure that it's capable of being delivered. We are now at a point, I believe, where we have a design which can be built, can be operated, can run for the next 120 years, and we have a construction methodology alongside that. But the challenge with it is, unfortunately, that's just unaffordable.
Okay, so it's sort of you're saying that now will be sort of on the shelf and can be taken off the shelf. Should funding become available?
Yeah, and for complete transparency, we will complete the work that has been done in a logical way, which will mean some, you know, a little bit more of expenditure just to make sure that you can package it up so that if financial circumstances change in, you know, 4, 5, 6 years' time, that actually we will be able to take that off the shelf, dust it down, and that concept design, the construction methodology, the operational arrangements which have all been prepared, you can take that. So this is not money wasted. This is a really important piece of work that could be dusted off and proceeded with at a future date.
Okay. And Heidi, in terms of other projects, do you have any concerns that cost estimates are wrong for other key transport strategy projects and that they therefore may become undeliverable?
Sat here today, no, I don't. I think we, do need to ask ourselves some tough questions about that initial estimate planning, but I'm not sat here with a list of schemes where I have those concerns. I would reiterate the point that David has made, though, about the very unique nature of this project, and one where Transport for London hasn't had previous experience of doing these sorts of projects. So if you think about some of the work at the big London Underground stations, be that the work at Victoria or Tottenham Court Road, we've seen those schemes come in on budget using exactly the same process that we've been using here in terms of our estimates of cost, our estimates around risk and construction inflation, etc. But I think where we're doing projects which are novel, projects where there isn't a comparator anywhere in the world, that's not to say we shouldn't try, because I think it would have been an incredible symbol and it would have been wonderful to have built a world first, but we've also got to be responsible and realistic.
Just sorry, just on that, Deputy Mayor, and not to abuse my chair's position, but it seems as if a number of projects on this side of the borough in the south, transport projects are being scrapped. So obviously we've seen the loss of the RV1 bus, this now bridge being paused. The obvious one I'm talking about, and I'll come to you, is about Bakerloo extension, which obviously has an impact on Lewisham. So really big transport projects which would have made a big difference to help alleviate some of those transport issues. So just to get your assurance that we won't be getting a letter in a few months to say that's now going to be paused. Obviously, I appreciate you don't have a Bakerloo line. I appreciate you don't have a magic pot of funding there, but just to make sure that we continue to work and engage with Southwark and Lewisham on that really important
I set out in the I understand the level of disappointment and anger that will exist amongst residents and elected representatives, be they around Rotherhithe or some people on the north side of the river as well who will be disappointed by it. What I would say though is that I said in the letter that the leader of the council sent to me, and I think you were a signatory to, that we plan to be going out to another consultation on the Bakerloo line extension later this year, which is a real concrete sign of our commitment to moving forward with that project. But as you rightly allude to, the funding and financing package for delivering the Bakerloo line extension is one where significant more work needs to be done, and nobody should underestimate the scale or complexity of that project either. But in terms of the benefits it could bring to that part of South London, I'm very, very familiar with them. What I would also say is that we are making significant progress with walking and cycling investments in Southwark and in this part of London. Work has already started on Cycleway 4 that goes from Tower Bridge down to Greenwich and then will be extended to Woolwich. We're also working with Southwark on a new cycle route from Rotherhithe to Peckham. I've asked TfL officers to accelerate their work to expand the Santander scheme further into Southwark, so that when we get this fantastic new cycleway built between Tower Bridge and Greenwich, that further along that route you can get Santander docked bikes, because I know that that is an aspiration that Southwark have. And so I understand why you make those points, but I think there is a lot of good news for Southwark. Lots of projects that we're working very, very well with them on.
Thank you.
Sorry, I just wanted to mention the Isle of Dogs as well in that context. That whilst the bridge may have been shelved for the time being, that we also remain focused on the very necessary transport upgrades that are needed for the island, which is suffering from massive overdevelopment.
Mm-hmm. So you're completely right to talk about the Isle of Dogs as well. We have worked very constructively with Hackney and Tower Hamlets Council on a new cycling route to go from Hackney all the way down to the Isle of Dogs. Of course, Canary Wharf will benefit from the new Crossrail station when it's opened, and I know that the leadership team at Crossrail moving heaven and earth to get the line open there as soon as possible. There are a number of other transport projects that we're working on in relation to the Isle of Dogs, and I'm happy to come and brief you upon those separately.
Sorry, can I just ask about the funding that's allocated to this in the business plan? What happens to that now? Does it sit there until a future point where the project might go ahead, or are you going to allocate it to other schemes?
So in this year's business planning cycle, which we're starting imminently, already underway internally within TfL, and we will publish the 2019 business plan in December of this year, we will look at all the competing priorities for that money. Clearly we have a lot of money that we have been to date able to protect around the wider Healthy Streets portfolio, investment in safer junctions, cycleways. I'm really keen that we do all that we can to protect that budget, but we will have to look at all the priorities in the round, and so we're not in a position at this point in time to say, well, we take that money and spend it on these projects. It doesn't work in that way. You have a much more holistic discussion over a number of months about what the priorities are.
Will that be a TfL board discussion?
So the TfL board are involved at an early stage, the board members in that discussion. As you would expect, myself and the Mayor are also briefed at various points along the process about what the thinking is, but ultimately yes, it's the TfL board that needs to sign off the business plan.
And finally, do you think that TfL needs to make the Mayor more aware of the complexity of flagship projects and the risks associated with them? I don't just mean this Mayor, I mean the Mayor as a...
I think to be fair to the TfL team, you know, since I was first briefed on this project back in July of last year, the challenges and the complexities have been highlighted to me, and I think we have had a mature and reasoned discussion between City Hall and Transport for London, and I think, to be honest, it's an example of good governance, and you could compare this, you know, to other projects such as the Garden Bridge, where a previous mayor may, in my view, have been throwing his weight around and not necessarily listening to advice being given to him, and I think this is the exact opposite of that situation.
Okay, thank you very much.
Assembly Member Russell.
Thank you. I want to move on and look at sort of how we go forward, and in particular want to find out a bit about what TfL's timeline is for the development and delivery of an alternative river crossing option like an enhanced ferry service.
Shall I start, and then perhaps David could pick up the detail? My understanding is that Transport for London would be looking to come back to us with some options by October of this year for a fast, frequent ferry service across the river between Rotherhithe and the Isle of Dogs. I would like to see, if at all possible, those ferries to be electric, but at the very least hybrid, so that we can gain some of the environmental benefits that we've seen down in Woolwich with the new ferries there. But just to reiterate, it'd be a very, I think it will be quite a new and exciting type of ferry service potentially. If you go to Amsterdam, you can see huge numbers of roll-on, roll-off ferries with huge numbers of pedestrians and cyclists accessing them easily. Now, the river in London is obviously a tidal river, and so we'd have to be confident that any vessel could navigate a tidal river. But that's the work that David and his team have been tasked with doing, looking at what the options are, looking at whether it would be a charged or an uncharged ferry, a free ferry. But we need to do that work over the next couple of months and hope to be in a position in October to say some more.
Do you want to add?
Just to add to that, we've got 7 work streams effectively that we're looking at to help inform that. So we're looking at things like route planning, both in terms of what's the service that's required across the river, as well as services that already run up and down the river. Quite a number of them stop at Canary Wharf, but they don't stop at Rotherhithe. Is there an opportunity there to think about how you could also service east-west travel along the river rather than just north-south? The fare strategy, so we need to do some further demand modelling around what happens at different gradients from free, which is one of the options that we put in the consultation back in 2017, through to different options around how you potentially charge for it. What are the vessels? So the Deputy Mayor's made reference to the fact that pure electric would be the preference, but we need to, what we don't want to do is get it wrong in terms of the tides on this part of the river and what's required in terms of the propulsion here, because it is quite a strong tide at this point. So we're looking at what's out there. We're also in discussions with organisations like Thames Clippers around the proposals that they've come up with. And then the piers, Canary Wharf Pier, Rotherhithe Pier, what needs to happen there to ensure that they can accommodate pedestrians, cyclists, and sort of roll-on, roll-off cyclists. One of the challenges is the piers go quite a long way up and down, so you need to think about those ramp gradients, ensuring that it's a seamless journey as possible. And then obviously how that ties in with complementary measures, as well as what does that mean for the demand of usage here and the costs associated with those different options. So that work is already happening, and the intention is that we will complete that by October.
Thank you. So are you thinking, so obviously this is instead of a bridge that would presumably have been free to use. So are you modelling this as a free service for pedestrians and cyclists to use?
That's certainly one of the options that we will test. as I'm sure you would expect, we need to understand what the cost implications of that were and report that back to our Programmes and Investments Committee, and that will be part of the consideration around what's the right solution going forward.
And in that decision-making process, you will be thinking about the benefits in terms of delivering the Mayor's transport strategy, in terms of getting more people, because presumably if it's free, then more people will use it and you will enable more trips by walking and cycling and more people to get out of the tube, as Florence was talking about earlier.
Absolutely, and that will be part of the what we call the sort of demand sensitivity modelling that we do. So you test different gradations of fares as well as different frequencies of service and other factors to help understand what does that mean in terms of the demand.
Because at the moment, if you go by tube from Canada Water to Canary Wharf, it's £1.70, whereas the single crossing on the river bus is £4.40. So there's, you know, if you want people to use a ferry service, you are very, very likely to need to either subsidise it a bit or subsidise it completely if you want to get those benefits for walking and cycling. Yes. The problem is the gaps in the walking and cycling networks. I mean, we saw the video at the beginning where the woman was saying she liked cycling, but you know, you've got to go all the way back to Tower Bridge to get yourself over the river. Are you looking at ferries, if you're looking at ferries at Rotherhithe, are you also thinking about them to fix other identified gaps like Canary Wharf to North Greenwich or relieving the Greenwich Foot Tunnel? Are you thinking about ferries not just on this alignment but on other alignments too?
So one of the things that David and I have discussed in TfL doing this piece of work is, you know, if we are going to be building new piers, for example, whether there is an option for those piers to be movable as well. And so, you know, there's a whole range of different things that we're looking at, and if it is you know, if we can move forward with this and it's proven to be a success, I think I would want TfL to be considering how you can improve connectivity across the river from the southern side to the north side and back again. And if that, you know, so, but I think we need to get this work done first before we start committing to a whole series of different things. So it's going to be a really interesting next couple of months awaiting the feedback from TfL.
Expecting to have more information in, was it October?
October,
yeah. Okay. And do you think that TfL would consider revisiting the bridge project in the future?
From my perspective, knowing what I know, you know, about the various competing priorities there are for whether it's within the Healthy Streets portfolio of funding or more broadly across the organisation around investment in better public transport, I find it difficult to envisage how in the next 5 years we will realistically be in a position to spend £500 million on a walking and cycling bridge in this location. And so whilst that work has been done and we talked about how it can be packaged up, ready to be taken off the shelf, dusted down, I think at the moment it's difficult to see how you can make an investment of that size within the next 5 years.
Mm-hmm. And so what about the other option that was thought about at the beginning was the idea of the Immerse Tunnel, which was 440 million, which then that starts to, in the context of the bridge having gone up so much, that starts to be a more interesting and more potentially more doable option. Would TfL consider looking at that option again?
So I think that might be one for David to answer in more detail.
So when we published the information back in 2017 on the options that we looked at, you're right, that the shortlisted tunnel option was what's called an Immerse Tunnel. And the reason that we went for that solution is because you want to try and minimise the amount of land you require for ramps back up to ensure that it's best usable for cyclists. But Immerse tunnels have challenges in themselves. You have to effectively dredge a trench in the riverbed, and then you're laying a tube in the riverbed. That has significant environmental implications. So that's an important consideration in it, and for that reason, we had quite significant concerns around the Immerse Tunnel option. The other consideration, which impacts on the demand, is that it's really challenging to create a pleasant and conducive environment within a tunnel for pedestrians and cyclists. Greenwich works quite well because it's a reasonably high level of footfall and activity in there, but it's still really challenging. We looked at examples from around the world, and there is and this was borne out by some research that we did of potential users, both existing cyclists and pedestrians, as well as potential people who could change their trips. When you ask them what's their propensity to change, a bridge had a much higher level of attraction than a tunnel because of people's concerns about personal security and other aspects. So whilst you're right when you look at it in terms of the cost now compared with the tunnel option when we costed in 2017, there are those other considerations which are very important in determining would that be the right solution to take forward, and I'd suggest that actually it wouldn't be.
So that suggests that you are that the ferry option is the thing that seems to be giving the best potential future. And can I just double check? Have you ruled out making the ferry option a free ferry service?
No, we haven't ruled that out.
Thank you.
I thought it's been covered actually.
Okay.
So.
Do you want to come in?
I was just going to say that I'm glad to note what you just said about the ferry crossing, because the one consultation meeting that I went to on the Isle of Dogs, very well attended meeting, and they weren't NIMBYs. The preferred option was actually for improved ferry service. Got a couple of hundred people were there.
Thanks.
Yeah, so a couple of questions. One, yesterday the Mayor said that you were looking to safeguard the route. I understand what you've talked about today, getting the package all ready so you can take it off the shelf in the future. But are you actually doing work to properly safeguard the route as we think about projects like Crossrail 2?
So on the southern side of the river at Doran's Wharf, which was the proposed landing point there, I think that's public open space, and so that is a slightly different question to the land on the northern side of the river at West Ferry Circus, and so TfL will need to have some discussions with Tower Hamlets about their planning policies and how they classify that land, I think, and David may be able to say something more about.
So we're having discussions with Tower Hamlets officers in terms of how you could provide protection for that for a future bridge. To the Deputy Mayor's point, on the Southwark side, because it's metropolitan open land, it has very strong protections around it already. But it is really the Tower Hamlets side where we're doing a little bit of work just to ensure that we keep that there for the future.
Being positive about that?
Certainly the discussions we've had with their officers to date have been very positive. There's a bit of work that we need to do with them to just take that forward.
And then just something, I was just reflecting on the PLA and their role in all of this, because, you know, it's a slightly strange body, and it's one that the previous mayor tried to sort of take over, but we didn't get very far on that. But clearly, right at the start, they must have said to you, way back when you started this project, this is the span we're looking at, this is the loadings, this is the height, you know, what the requirements were for a bridge. And then it sounds to me that potentially more recently that's changed. Are you able to provide in the information after this meeting to us what it was right at the start and then what it's become, just to understand whether their position has slightly changed along the route which may have affected this? Because obviously we're looking at TfL and you've got all these experts helping you, but what's the PLA's role been? And have they always been really supportive of this, or have they been rather more cautious?
So there were three fundamentals where we started with the PLA. The first one was that there should be a 20-metre height clearance above what's called spring high water levels. So we've come down from 20 to 15 to 12. They also made very clear that the navigable channel should be kept clear because of the way that boats move on this part of the Thames. And the other one was that there needs to be absolute certainty when boats are coming down from Tower Bridge for the largest of the boats.
That it's open.
Exactly, because there is nowhere to stop effectively between Tower Bridge and Rotherhithe. Now, what we did with the PLA is we had vessel surveys that have been running for nearly 2 years now, gathering data around how vessels move on this part of the Thames, what the size and the other characteristics of those vessels were, and that evidence has been absolutely crucial in terms of being able to get to the agreement of that lower height, as well as what's the appropriate width of the navigable channel, and what are those sort of adverse events that you also need to be able to plan for, and why you need to think about the size of the ship, impact protection and other considerations. Okay. So they have been very good at taking a data-led approach, as we have tried to do as well, in terms of determining that's where we started and this is where we've got to now.
It would just be helpful if we could have the numbers in writing, the span, the loadings, the height, just to understand that process as well. Because as I say, I know in the past there have been concerns that PLA may have been an obstacle rather than, fully engaged partners. So that would just be helpful. Thank you.
Assemblymember Prince.
Just very quickly, have you considered making the ferry? I know you're in the very early stages, but paying for the ferry is just making it like just part of the bus system. So if you're on a journey like you would be on the hopper fare, if you go on it during the 1 hour, then it's free. But obviously, if it's your first journey of the day, then it's £1.50. But it's also benefits from the capping. So just make it like part of the bus system. I think that would be something that most people would find acceptable, because if you're coming off the tube, you wouldn't be any extra cost and things like that.
Your thinking is very much along the lines of our thinking in terms of one of the scenarios that we will test. So we will be testing it free, as well as what's comparable cheapest alternative that you might use on public transport in terms of fares, as well as what's the difference in terms of the fares that are charged today. And one of the Assembly managers mentioned the fare and comparison with that with the travel card. So yes, there are a number of different tests we'll do, but absolutely that's a good one to do.
Okay, thank you.
Great. No, thank you for that. I think this is something we will continue to look at from the committee, and it will be helpful just to get regular updates from you. And we'll look forward to that initial report back in October on the ferry options. Just to thank our guests, and can we note the report and the discussions, please?
Yes,
great. Can we agree to delegate with authority to meet in consultation with the party leads and Assemblymember Pigeon to agree any follow-up to this meeting?
Agreed.
And the date of our next committee meeting is scheduled for Wednesday, the 11th of September at 10 a.m. in the chamber.
Okay.
No other business?
No.
No, thank you.
Chair.
Well done.